Hello, everybody. It is the Lawn Gnome, and welcome to another episode of Sunday Sit Down, the show where anything goes and nothing is left behind. As always, I'm sure that you're all very excited for another great topic. And let me tell you guys something. I am so excited for this specific topic because it is a conversation that I have wanted to have with so many people, and I don't know why it never came to fruition. So when I decided that Sunday Sit Downs was going to be a thing over here on my channel, I said we are finally going to tackle this topic. And it's all about the topic of the classic. And the best part about that is it can be a barrage of things in popular culture and entertainment. Classic books, classic films, even classical music if you want to go in that direction, or maybe even classical board games. I don't know, whatever you think is good for you. But the most important thing is the person who is going to be joining me today is someone who has been putting this together with me for the longest time. We did not think that this was ever going to get done. For all we knew, it could have happened after the pandemic. But either way, I am very excited to have Alexandra from the channel, A Lovely Jaunt, where she teaches people to read better and not more. So Alexandra, I am just so glad to have you here this afternoon. Thank you so much for joining me today on my show.
You know, Steve, I'm so excited to be here too. This, as you said, has been a long time coming. We've been planning this for a long time. And we had, you know, our earlier collaboration on classic film and on classic literature that we each did as a video on our channels. And so I'm just so excited because I think this is going to give us an opportunity to dig in even deeper on this topic, which is obviously a passion of mine.
Oh, absolutely. And I think it's also the perfect time to do this, especially just what's, been happening in the world today. So many people are going back into the past in the world of popular culture, and they're wondering, what exactly do we do in terms of understanding the way that books were written way back or how movies were directed. I mean, one of the things that has been very much in the news for the last couple of days recently, not even weeks, just maybe about a few days, is the whole recreation of the famous Disney park ride Splash Mountain, which is based on a 1940s Disney film that is basically being put in the vault and locked away forever. And that's really what it is. Like, we think about these things, we question these things. And that's why I'm so excited to talk to you about this, because I do watch your channel, and what I really appreciate is the fact that you really are stepping away from what we normally see in the booktube community. Not saying that knowing about what's new and exciting is good, but there's that famous line, we don't know where we're going until we know where we've been. And we really need to find more people like ourselves that are really trying to go back in time and embrace the way things used to be, to get a better understanding of how it shaped these exact mediums over the last maybe 30 or 40 years.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really hard to get a proper context for where we should be going if you don't know where we've come from.
Exactly. So, as always, I like to begin at the beginning, which is usually when I ask someone to talk a little bit about their past. But this topic deserves a different kind of question to begin the introduction. And I'm really curious to see your answer on this one. And that is, what is your definition of a classic?
Well, I think there's really two attributes that I'd like to highlight. I don't know if there's anything that's really definitive about it, but it's almost like two tests that I would apply, whether it be a book, music, movies, whatever. And the first one is that it passes the test of time. I think it's really, really hard for us to be able to determine what are the really worthwhile and valuable works when we're embroiled in the midst of a movement. And usually the test of time is really going to help us determine that. So one of the examples that I give a lot of times is like movements with music, because that happens a lot faster, and movements with fashion, that happens a lot faster. And so if you kind of think about like, oh, whether the young kids listening to these days, you always have the older generation being like, I don't understand how you can listen to that. That all sounds the same. Oh, back in my day, we listened to XYZ, right? But you get 10, 20 years out, and the songs that are still getting airplay are the best exemplars of that movement of music. And it's a lot easier to see the intrinsic value of that movement and sort of like the mediocre versions who are working in that same feeling, who are working in that same mode, but maybe we're not an excellent exemplar of what that movement was trying to accomplish, kind of fall by the wayside and they don't get airplay. And you can imagine the same thing with books, like especially maybe the Victorian era where serialization was really popular and they were putting out a lot of literature. I mean, Dickens is writing these massive books. Well, how many other books were published by serializing magazines that we no longer know about because they just didn't pass the test of time and they sort of faded into the distance because they didn't really embody some of those essential values that we see, you know, sort of as that through line in the humanities. And I think the test of time really reveals that.
Oh yeah, I mean, yeah, I mean, if I'm
Go
going to
ahead.
go into a medium like that, I think when it comes to something that truly stands the test of time is the comic book industry. I mean, you've got some of these legendary characters that were created. I mean, it's hard to believe that 2 years ago we celebrated the 80th anniversary of Superman, and then the following year, which was last year, we celebrated the 80th anniversary of Batman. This year, we're celebrating the 80th anniversary of Bugs Bunny. I mean, it is amazing when you take a look at the fact that these are characters that if you go to someone from Generation Z, because I will well, you know, the funny thing is, I don't really know what I am these days. Some people say that I'm a millennial. Some people say I'm the last year of Generation X. I would probably classify myself as a Generation Xer because I was born literally right when MTV became a thing. So I don't really know what it is. But basically, it's like the fact that these younger generations, you mention these characters and they know who they are. And if a young boy or girl actually mentions Superman to a parent or a grandparent, if that person actually read those comics, they say, let me tell you what Superman was like when I was reading him. But I really appreciated your thoughts about music because it's funny when I listen to the classic rock stations that, you know, when I was growing up, you know, they were playing the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, which they still do. But now they're
Right.
playing Green Day and they're playing the Red Hot Chili Peppers and Pearl Jam. I was like, I remember when these songs were new. Like, it's such a weird feeling to me.
Yeah. And it's not going to be all, it's not even all of the Beatles. It's not even all of Led Zeppelin. It's not, and so it's not all of Pearl Jam and the Red Hot Chili Peppers either. It's their best exemplars that are going to stand the test of time.
Exactly.
And I think one of the reasons, like you said, these characters from comic books are continue to be relevant and continue to pass the test of time is because they're working with these deep archetypal sort of stories. So we have the classic hero and superhero in Superman. We have the classic anti-hero in Batman. Bugs Bunny is an incarnation of the trickster god. He's basically a Loki figure type. And that's why we see these characters sort of like incarnating in different versions over and over again. And these are sort of, you know, that's the definition of an archetype, but that's one of the ways in which these stories can pass the test of time is they're working within these old patterns and these sort of ancient storylines.
Yeah, that's an excellent perception of that. I wouldn't even think about it like that, but it's also very interesting because of the fact that, you know, one of the things that I'm very happy about when it comes to YouTube is, especially being the film watcher that I am, I want to, because my definition of a classic film, I personally would define something like that as something that was like from the very beginning, you know, something that came out in a time that definitely is not what it was when I was growing up, like a truly different time and place, a different atmosphere, a different way of thinking. And I always knew that some of these movies were to be known as the greatest of all time, true classics. Even if I didn't see them, I always said, I know that there's something really good about these movies. It's not that I don't want to watch them, but being this content creator, I'm now watching all of these great films. And the thing that I love so much about it is seeing where film was at a certain point and how so many future directors over the decades would take those elements and modernize them and make them something new and exciting in a different way for younger generations to enjoy. I think that that's really nice to know that we have those kinds of things, especially in books. Like, you know, when I go on YouTube, there are some channels where I see people reading Shakespeare or people reading Jane Austen novels or Agatha Christie. These are like some of the big names. It's nice to know that people are reading these kinds of books still. It's nice to know that they still do serve some kind of a relevancy.
Yeah, and I think, you know, I'm going to get super philosophical here, but I think what we see is that this story gets reborn over and over, like you're saying. It gets repackaged, whether it be in film, whether it be, you know, Shakespeare being repackaged in film or being repackaged in different ways. These sort of, like I said, archetypal ancient stories that really resonate with us. But, you know, it's that sense of the moment where the presency of something sort of touches with its timelessness. Like that's the transcendent and eternal quality of a story. And it's really hard to beat. It's just really hard to beat.
Yeah.
But I did want to say that a second attribute that I really think is important for determining what's classics. And for, at least for the canon, you know, but to be honest, it really could be in any incarnation of the arts. It has to be a part of the grand conversation, if you will. And this is where arts and criticism have this sort of complementary effect with one another. And ultimately, that's what the humanities are for. Whether you're studying film, whether you're studying art, whether you're studying literature, we're coming to this table, if you will, to join in the conversation, to ask and answer the question, what does it mean to be human? And I think the greatest works throughout time also participate in that conversation as well. So they pass the test of time, and are they participating in the grand conversation about the humanities?
Well said. Well said. Also, you just had a great idea pop into my head when you were talking about a specific story that is repackaged. I think the perfect example for that is basically some of the classic Disney films, the princess films. It's the same concept, but look at how they constantly reinvent it. It's like the fact that you can take a young person or an older person and they can literally pick out of a hat all the big Disney princesses and really explain what makes them all their individual selves and what makes them all special and how they're not necessarily a copy of each other. That's a perfect, brilliant example, I would think.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, working with ancient stories, these ancient fairy tales, how old were they before they got written down, you know?
Exactly,
So
exactly. Right, so
all
let's go
things, all things.
Yeah. Yeah, the funny thing is, old things these days are now turning out to be things that I found that when they were new, and that's what's kind of scaring me these days. But anyway, let's go into the second question. What do you feel it is about the classics that makes them the coveted items that they are to so many?
Well, okay, I think I'd like to sort of extend this question.
Feel free.
And so I think, again, it comes back to that issue where, you know, we have sort of something that is speaking to the zeitgeist of a present culture while also speaking to our history as humanity. And that's what makes something transcendent. And so I think that is sort of at the core of what makes them so valuable. But I think that I thought it was such an interesting word that you chose. You said coveted. And I think this covetousness is also kind of like the dark side of being interested in classics or high art or whatever. And that touches on like the snobbery side of things.
Okay.
And I think I've been thinking about this idea a lot because I really, really enjoy classics, but I really, really hate snobby people. Nobody likes snobs. And so every once in a while, because I'm attracted to the things that I'm attracted to, and I enjoy reading the books that I enjoy reading, I'll start a conversation with somebody who also likes classics, but I just don't enjoy the conversation, and I walk away from it thinking like, what has happened? Like, I have something in common with this person. Like, they're really passionate about the same thing that I am. Why did I feel like so frustrated and so irritated about the way that this conversation went? And what I've realized is that there's sort of like two principles that are being inverted a lot of times when we talk about the covetable value of the high arts, if you will. And the first principle is that people sometimes use classic works, classic arts, to sort of apply to themselves a sense of self-worth, a sense of like, I'm better than somebody else because I've read these things, or because I understand art, or because I appreciate what's really good music. And it gives them the opportunity in their own mind to look down their nose at other people. But what they're confusing is that people have intrinsic value, but art has value, a variable worth, right? So some books are better than others, some paintings are better than others, some works of music are better than others. And people have the tendency to invert those two principles. And I think that's where the covetousness comes in, is they're trying to borrow what they perceive as intrinsic value in these works and add it to themselves. But it's just really, I think, important to remember that the intrinsic value resides in the person, but the art itself has variable value. And I think, anyway, I went far afield on that question, but it's something that I think is really, really important. Reading great literature is wonderful, but it doesn't make you better than anybody else.
Yeah, I'm not going to deny the fact that when I was a little bit younger, my snobbery was definitely in the music category, because I still remember that magical year of 1999 when the boy band made the big comeback, and we had the Backstreet Boys, we had NSYNC, and we had Britney Spears and Christina Aguilera, all these big names, and I was like, how could you listen to these artists? Like, they don't play instruments, they don't write their own music. And so I was like, and the funny thing was, I actually have said this to so many people, because of my distaste for that kind of music at the time, I went down a path and discovered heavy metal, which was a series of music that I never thought I would ever listen to in my life. But when I learned how the origins actually go back to the style of music that was written all the way back to medieval times, I was like, really? This music has that kind of history? And then when you see just how vast it is, and all the thing that I like so much about heavy metal music is, sometimes, especially when it comes to an artist's concept album, it's literally like they're writing a story and telling you a story. There are some of these bands that like go very fantasy driven, and I love that. But, you know, I had to understand that not everybody has to like everything that you like. You know, there's something about something else that you may not like that somebody else actually truly finds value in. And the only way for you to understand those types of things is to see what it is that makes it so, you know, adored by other people. I mean, the reason why I feel classics are held dear to so many people, or maybe not to so many people, I'm not exactly sure, is, you know, the thing that always gets me nervous is the fact that when we forget about important things, you know, it possibly creates the ability for things to repeat themselves, and not necessarily in the best of ways. And and I always feel that, you know, when books were first being written and movies were first being filmed, I was saying to myself, like, there's got to be some meaning to these things. Because especially like when I talked about, I think what's actually really funny is, when I was growing up, you know, the movie that was the end all be all for me, like the greatest movie of all time, was Star Wars. Like, I always said, Star Wars is the best movie. Star Wars is amazing. It's a classic. But now that I've actually been watching movies like Spartacus and All About Eve and so many others, just to name a few, I'm just saying to myself, maybe I was wrong the whole time. There's something, this is not one of those truly great classic films, because these films give me so much more. So I think that that's one of the most important things about seeing those kinds of movies. It's important to be someone who's willing to dip their toe in a variety of things to get a sense of the grand scale.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it kind of does go back to this issue that we're circling around a lot, which is like, what makes something of eternal value, and what makes something, you know, a flash in the pan, popular in the moment. But then I always think like, well, what is it about this that has captured the hearts and minds of so many? And I think, you know, with Star Wars, it's actually very easy to point out how it's, again, working in those archetypal, because it was quite consciously done. Lucas was a big fan of Joseph Campbell, who worked in mythology, and he wrote a book called The Hero with a Thousand Faces. You may be familiar with this.
I had
and
actually heard about that, yes.
Yeah, so he's working very consciously in these archetypes, and so you can see their power in that they get repackaged for the culture in which it is made, but it has this eternal core that is being recycled. And I would say the same thing about Twilight too. Like, it's one thing to sort of say like, oh, it's such a shallow, stupid book, and oh, it's really dumb and blah, 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 which, you know, I'm not going to debate you on that. But I think the more interesting question to ask is like, well, being so shallow and dumb, why has it captured the hearts of and minds of so many people? And what you see when you sort of pull it back is like, oh, it's working within the same framework as Beauty and the Beast. This is a classic romance fairy tale archetype structure that it's working within. And so it's been repackaged for, you know, the culture in which it was born, but it has this eternal core that sort of gets recycled over and over again.
Wow. That's you make some excellent points there. I got to admit that. So in regards to moving on to the third question, and I think that this is going to be a very interesting topic. What do you feel could possibly be the contributing factor as to why a lot of younger generations don't care about the classics? I mean, before I give you the chance to answer, I mean, I just know that there were some people in my life that refused to see a movie because it was black and white, you know?
Right.
And the funny part is there are even some movies that are actually being made today that are black and white, which is actually kind of funny. But
Right.
it makes me a little sad when younger people, or even people my age, will actually say, I'm not interested in seeing that movie. It's so old. It's not meaningful anymore. Honestly, I highly disagree with that way of thinking, because my attitude is classics in all shapes and forms provide a lot of educational value. That's the way that I look at it. But I don't know. It's like I said, when I was younger, I wasn't really watching a lot of these older movies from the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, but I always knew that they were important and good movies. So I'm really glad that I'm going into these movies and actually doing that. And I got to admit, I'm still trying to do the same thing in other shapes and forms of mediums, particularly books, but maybe it's just because of the fact that I'm just trying to find the time for that too. I mean, like, I don't read as much as an average booktuber does. For me, that's virtually impossible. But
neither do I.
Yeah. I mean, to be a little bit humorous here, I actually am reading William Shakespeare's Star Wars, which is actually an interesting conglomerate of two different kinds of popular culture icons. So, to a certain degree, I will say that I am reading something more modern in a classic format. So maybe that counts to a degree. But how do you feel about the younger generations, or even people in our own groups that had that attitude about classic films and other things that are of classic nature?
Well, I have about 50 million thoughts, so I'll
There
start
you go.
there. But first, I think that it's probably true for every generation. I think in the same way that the older generation has a tendency to poo-poo the new things that are coming out by the young people, the younger generation seems to have an attitude of maybe disrespect towards the older things, or a little bit of a dismissive attitude at the maybe not disrespectful, but maybe a little bit dismissive attitude to the things that came before. And so I think that's, on one level, that's the natural development of like art in its cycle. So and that's where the archetypal story of rebirth comes from as well. Is like the younger generation has to sort of break free of the strictures of the traditional art from the generation that came before to make their own thing. And then that becomes calcified into its own sets of rules, and the pattern goes over and over and over again. But to get to the core of your question, I think, you know, we also talk about the fact that you need to know the rules to know how to break them well. And so if you don't, again, get the context of what everything has been that has come before you, then it's really hard to know where you should be breaking the rules, what you should be keeping with you, maybe that is valuable, if you're just doing so in ignorance, right? And every once in a while, it's not very often, but every once in a while, I'll hear that classic argument of they're just a bunch of dead old white guys. Like, why should I care what they think? And I mean, obviously there are historical and structural biases that were around the publication of books from 500, 200, 300 years ago, where it was like women were not published. People of color just, first of all, didn't have the education of literacy by and large to even write something, let alone be published. So we know that we're getting a select group just by the structures of society in which a lot of these books were written. But that doesn't mean that the perspective of old dead white guys is therefore invalidated. It just means that it's insufficient. It doesn't mean that I shouldn't read these books. It means that I just shouldn't read only these books. And I think this is where the conversation about diversity in your reading becomes really, really relevant. And I think ultimately what the great works of Western culture show us is the scaffolding of our society. And I think there's a great movement right now to sort of reflect on who we are as a society and bring in a critical eye and say, okay, where have we failed? What are the things that maybe need to be trimmed back, that need to be called back? And again, without the contextual knowledge, without really taking the time to understand the foundations of why our structure is the way that it is, why our society has been built the way that it is, it's hard to know when you're culling something back. Am I pulling off some weeds that really need to be trimmed back? Or am I pulling off like a major like supporting beam for something? And there's going to be some major consequences if philosophically we remove this idea from the culture that we're living in. You know, progressivism isn't just change for change's sake. Progressivism is moving forward, and it's hard to know if you're moving forward if you don't have contextual surroundings. You don't know what direction you're going in. And I think that, you know, that the classics just give us such an important context for who we are so we can know where we should be going.
Right. Yeah, because I think one of the perfect examples that happened very recently was the launch of HBO Max. And one of the things that they did very, very soon after they launched their platform was they took Gone with the Wind down. Now, first of all, people need to have an attention span that is bigger than the size of a peanut to actually understand that, no, HBO Max did not take it down permanently. They specifically said, yes, we're taking it down now, but we're putting it back up for the purposes of just being able to add the disclaimer. That's why I appreciate what Warner Brothers and its other affiliates does do, and why I get upset when Disney doesn't. I don't appreciate the fact that Disney is trying to somewhat erase what they did that is classified as controversial. And as I said earlier, Song of the South is a perfect example. I don't know how, but I actually managed to find myself a decent copy of that film. And I personally wanted to take a look at it and see what it was that made it so controversial. So I saw it and I understand it, but I feel that someone pretending that something like that didn't exist is not necessarily the right direction to go. Rather, I feel that I agree with what my wife says. That movie should be used in the education system to give young children an idea of what it was like in the industry and how segregation in the 1940s played a huge role in those creations of those kinds of films. Yes, you're absolutely right. In the beginning of, the funny thing is, like when you say the golden age of Hollywood, there are some people that get very offended by that because it was just a bunch of old white men that were in charge. Well, that is not wrong. There's truth to that. But golden age refers to the specific atmosphere and the specific style in which the film was made. I mean, when people went to the movies in the 1930s and 40s and even 50s, it was like going to Carnegie Hall. They dressed in their Sunday best. They went to the movies as if it was a real treat. And that was what going to see a movie like Gone with the Wind or Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs was. It was a truly magical, different kind of atmosphere. And I feel that younger generations to a certain degree, I think one of the other faults is, to a certain degree, the generations before them, because they're not making an effort to teach these younger people to explore what else is out there. I mean, I still remember when I would drag my mother to take me to one of these dumb children's movies, and then she would say to me, you really need to see a movie like this or a movie like this, etc., etc. But also, one of the things that I wanted to harp on was the best part about the literature and film and the music industry, especially, I always say that the big year for these specific types of entertainment was, the year was 1967. When that year happened, there were so many things that were being done by all these different artists to reflect on the time. You take a look at the music world, and there were so many protest songs for the Vietnam War coming out. You take a look at the movie industry, you had two of the most landmark films, ironically, both starring Sidney Poitier. You had Guess Who's Coming to Dinner and the Best Picture winner In the Heat of the Night, which played upon the times of segregation, and a white woman dating a black woman, a white cop in the South asking a black cop in the North to help him solve a case in a place where he knows he is not welcome. But there's also now the talk about the whole white savior thing, and a lot of people talk about that specifically with one of the more recent films, Green Book. You see, I understand where they're coming from, but I'm not necessarily saying that that's something that should be shamed, because it's trying to send a message. And also, the other thing that I appreciate about these classic films, when you take a look at a war film, for example, it was done in a certain way to reflect war, etc., etc. But now you get movies like 1917 and Spike Lee's recent film, Da 5 Bloods, which doesn't necessarily talk exactly about the war itself, but it talks about a group of black soldiers and their flashbacks, and they're dealing with PTSD and how the war shaped their futures. I appreciate the fact that these young directors, like Spike, well, they're not even that young, but like newer directors like Spike Lee and Sam Mendes, who have been like the big names now for the last 20, 30 years, they're taking something that was done before and, like you said, repackaging them in a way that's very, very new. And I appreciate that, but I feel that if you're going to appreciate movies like 1917 or even the new Tom Hanks film, Greyhound, you should see The Bridge on the River Kwai. You should see From Here to Eternity. You should see The Great Escape. You should see those movies and see how they influenced the filmmakers of the newer generations in recent years.
Yeah, I think, wow, there's a lot to talk about there. I think, in the sense of erasing our past versus keeping our past in its place and just understanding it with new perspective. I want to start there. I think a really great example of this is the way that, the Germans have made memorials for the tragedy that was Hitler's reign in Nazism. They don't make these memorials to glorify anything. They make these memorials as a reminder to themselves in the present, and frankly to us, that something tragic and something evil happened here. And it's a point to have humility, not to have glory, right? And I think that kind of touches on the idea of sort of like this golden age of Hollywood, right? Because the language that we use to describe it is powerful. So I don't think there's anything wrong with appreciating those movies and appreciating the culture of the specialness of going to film, the glory of going to film at the time. But if we call it the golden age, then that sets itself up in a way to sort of commemorate it with a positive view, which it's a mixed bag like everything is, right? And so I think maybe transforming the language around which we talk about it is more important and far more powerful than engaging in this type of historical erasure where we're sort of like, we don't want to see the blemishes of the things that were done in the past, because the reality is we're just as vulnerable to make those mistakes today. It's not that humanity is somehow psychologically or biologically different. We have those same vulnerabilities and those same susceptibilities. And that's why remembering it is so important.
I agree, 100%.
So I know you talked about a lot of other things, but that was the one that sort of came to mind.
Well, that's the beauty of this show. You don't have to talk about everything. Just talk about what you feel is most important to discuss. Either way, it's a good conversational piece either way. So yeah, so here's an interesting one. So
Okay.
let's take a look at the fact that we are now we're now in 2020. You know, you and I may not have seen, we were definitely not alive over the entirety of the last 40 years. But
No,
one of the few things, that I'm pretty sure is we have definitely dived into popular culture that has existed for the last 40 years. So now we're taking a look at some of these books and movies and music. I mean, it is unbelievable to know that this past week, Ringo Starr turned 80 years old. Mazel tov. Unbelievable. The fact that we unfortunately just lost one of the greatest comedic minds in Carl Reiner, who so many people know today, which is amazing, and see what he had done throughout his entire legacy in his career. But then we take a look at the fact that the Harry Potter story has reached its 20-year anniversary recently. The fact that this year is the 35th anniversary of Back to the Future. So these are now somewhat being referred to as classics, but there are some people that say they're not the same, like Back to the Future. I'm thinking about a couple of other movies that are just recently celebrating anniversaries. Caddyshack just turned 40 this year, and I just watched that movie for the first time in a long time, and I will say what I've said in my review. It is one of the most pointless, most horribly put together films in the history of the industry. But why is it so great and loved amongst so many? It's because it's just so funny. And that's what it was made for. It was just made for people to have a good time. I just watched for the very first time Smokey and the Bandit. That's a movie that so many people know. It is by no means a Casablanca or a Lawrence of Arabia or the Ten Commandments, but it's a rip-roaring good fun time. That's what it is. So let's talk about these things that are called nowadays the modern classics, and should or could they be held in the same regards as some of these other things? Like, would Harry Potter pretty much hold a candle to Anne of Green Gables or, you know, Isaac Asimov's Foundation? You know, like, what would you say to something like that?
Well, I think, okay, well, first of all, I want to say that I think there's a really important distinction, and I make this distinction a lot when I'm reading, but I think it's true, and you pointed it out really, really well in your discussion of certain films, is that there's a difference between reading for understanding and there's a difference between reading for entertainment. And I love both. I absolutely love reading for entertainment, and I also love watching movies for entertainment. And then I think that there's also, and I think the streams can cross too, that a lot of movies that are extraordinarily entertaining are also extraordinarily deep, and vice versa. There's also some amazing entertaining films that are not deep at all, right?
Yeah.
And that's great. That's all they're trying to be, and that's all I want them to be. So cool, enjoy it. Like, no judgment. And I do think that there are going to be classic books that come out of the last 40 years that are going to be held in the same regard. I just don't know what those are yet. Can Harry Potter hold a candle with like the Anne of Green Gables series or Little House on the Prairie or something like that? Yeah, absolutely. Especially when you look at the quality of writing, I actually think they're fairly comparable. Or Narnia or something like that. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, there you go.
I think, you know, it's a little bit easier for me to like judge children's books against children's books. I don't know that Harry Potter is easy for me to compare to like like what we would consider like adult, you know. So is it the next Steinbeck? That's hard for me to say. I think probably not. But I don't know what I've read in modern literature. Maybe Ian McEwan might be an author who is very modern and recent, who I suspect is probably going to be, you know, what we consider a modern classic. I think Margaret Atwood is going to be an author. I think many of her works are going to be enduring. And I think they're absolutely going to be held in the same regard. That's what humanities does. That's what it, it's like, did Charles Dickens have any idea that he was going to be Charles Dickens as we understand him when he was writing, or Jane Austen? Jane Austen had no idea the enduring power that she was going to have. She was very private, even when fame did come to her in her own life. It's like, and now she's like this whole cultural movement. Like she's,
Yeah, doesn't she have like a TV miniseries or movie right now starring Haley Steinfeld?
There's like, and how many times have her books been remade into movies? And I find that really interesting. George Eliot versus Jane Austen, like what makes Jane Austen so much more culturally relevant and culturally powerful year after year, generation after generation. So, this is just what art does. It goes through cycles and it continues to move forward. So absolutely, there are going to be amazing works of fiction, of literature, of film, of music that are going to be transcendent, that are going to pass this test of time. I'm not exactly sure what all of them are yet. I know what some of my favorites are, and I have some suspicions, but again, only time will tell. And the generations that come after us will be saying the same thing about the art that they make in their own time.
Yeah, I still think that one of the best like jaw-dropping things that you could possibly do to a person is when you tell them that Clueless is actually a modern-day telling of Emma, and that 10 Things I Hate About You is a modern-day version of Taming of the Shrew, or the fact that like when people have that conversation, like I've had this conversation with friends so many times, I'm going to go back to Disney, how many Disney films are actually original stories, and almost all the time someone is going to say The Lion King is one of them, and then someone's going to say no, it's not, it's based on Shakespeare, it's Hamlet. That's the best part, that's the funny part. But I'll tell you what I really am going to talk, and I agree with you 100%, because I just watched a movie that came out in 2007. And the funny thing is, when I first saw it, I enjoyed it, but I didn't actually think that it was like great compared to some of the films that came before it. It was Ratatouille, and I just posted my review for that film. Every single time I watch it, I cannot get over how truly brilliant in terms of storytelling that story is. There are so many things that people can take away from it and adapt to it in real life, because what got me to make my review the way that I did was based on another person's review of the film, and she said that the most impactful scene was when Remy's father says to him, "You can't change nature," to which Remy responds, "Change is nature, Dad, and it starts when we decide." Think about how impactful a statement like that is made in what's going on in the world today in regards to social ways of living. Think about how impactful that is. And also, the other thing that I love about that movie is the fact that they were not afraid to dive and bring a classically trained actor like Ian Holm or Peter O'Toole to actually voice those characters. I mean, like, when you get one of those truly great actors who you know is capable of so much to do a voice for a Disney character, that to me just moves mountains. The fact that they're willing to use their wonderful talent and give us these beautiful characters is just so wonderful. I mean, I'll go back to one of the most brilliant cartoons that was made in the 1990s, and that's Batman the Animated Series. It was just a bunch of guys.
I love that series.
Yes.
It was so good.
Yes, I'm rewatching it right now. I'm watching volume 3 right now, and it's just so beautiful to see the fact that there's that one episode, Beware the Grey Ghost, where they said, this is the story of Bruce Wayne and Batman fighting alongside their childhood TV idol, and they're like, we gotta get Adam West. And Adam West Adam West unfortunately was not in a good place at that point in time. And they brought him back to voice this character, the Grey Ghost, and it was wonderful. And then before you know it, he is called by Seth MacFarlane and says, I want you to be on Family Guy as Mayor Adam West. And to this, and the day that he died, when we found out that Adam West died, he didn't die in obscurity. He was embraced by so many people, and the last thing that he did for his acting career was he voiced his Adam West Batman alongside Burt Ward in a film called Batman versus Two-Face. So the fact that he had his last acting piece doing what made him famous, it's just like, I felt that his career just came full circle, and he left us with people just appreciating a truly classic actor from the golden age / silver age of television. You know, that's something that I hold very dear to my heart. It's nice to know that people who watch something like Batman the Animated Series are interested in watching the George Reeves Superman series and the Adam West Batman series. Oh man, if they even want to go deeper and watch the Linda Carter Wonder Woman series, more power to them. Like, it's just nice to know that certain things will actually drive people to see these older versions of these characters. Again, that's why I feel that comic books are truly the best place where classic characters are truly embraced and celebrated, because they have this ongoing story, and every single time a new writer and a new artist picks up that pencil and starts creating a new issue of this legendary figure, the fact that they're trying to make these characters go into different places and do things that they've never done before just to shake things up, the younger reader embraces it, but the older reader embraces it as well. That's what I love so much about something being timeless like that.
Yeah, and I think that speaks to, you know, the timelessness of the story. It doesn't matter the medium that it like is incarnated in. If you like film, you're gonna find it. If you like comic books, you're gonna find it. If you like books like me, you're gonna find it. If you like tapestries, I'm sure you're gonna find it. But you know, the medium doesn't really matter. It's the story that matters.
Exactly. I agree with you 100%. So now we've touched a little bit about this, but now we're really going to expand upon it. We're going to talk about the current events, the fact that we're really in monumental times right now, really, really changing times, and attitudes are really in a very interesting and dynamic place. So now it's really about going and taking a look at these old things and wondering, because of the fact that they weren't perfect, or the fact that they were written at a different time and not necessarily with the greatest of intentions, you know, should they be forgotten and shamed, or is preservation the better choice? Because one of the few things that gets me very, very scared is when someone's going to say one day, Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird should not be read. It's a bad depiction of Black people in the South and white people in the South. It's a bad, bad piece of material. But, and you could definitely harp on this, you know, even Shakespeare was not held in high graces by lots of different people, you know, like the book burnings, or like when disco is dead, you know, the record burnings, or when someone said, like, oh man, remember, I don't know if you even know about this or even recall this, but remember, I don't know if you know, but there was that artist, Sinead O'Connor, who performed a song on Saturday Night Live, and then she ripped up a picture of the Pope. And after that, like, the mob went after her, you know? Right. So do you see where I'm getting at? I know I touched a little bit and got a little bit wordy, but you see where I'm going.
Yeah, I think that you get into real problems when you start advocating for censorship. And I just am not going to advocate for censorship. I think these works that are problematic need to be understood for what they are. And I think there's a little bit of a mistake of saying that that's how those people over there in that time thought and behaved, and they're extraordinarily different from me, as if we ourselves are not vulnerable, kind of as I said earlier, to those same flaws and those same faults. Part of what the importance of classic literature, with its good and its bad, with its wisdom and with its, you know, flaws, is for us to have an attitude of humility and for us to approach these issues and these topics and these works by saying, okay, how does this convict me as a person? Because we all have a capacity for evil. We all have a capacity for racism. We all have a capacity for oppression. We all have a capacity for this. And so it's my responsibility to then use these works as a mirror, not as a way to sort of say like, oh, to distance myself as if I couldn't do these things. Absolutely. Each and every one of us have that capacity within us. And we have to be able to reconcile ourselves to that. We have to be able to take responsibility for our own capacity for evil. And that's what part of what marches forward in time with these classic works is this convicting aspect to it, or at least that's how I read them, is when I read a Robinson Crusoe and we have those cringeworthy scenes where he meets Friday and he can't pronounce his name and he gives him a new name, and it's just highly, highly paternalistic, highly, highly offensive. And I think to myself, well, what about the times when I made a joke about how I couldn't pronounce somebody's name? That wasn't okay. And it convicts me. And that's what the power of classic literature is that we need these stories because they tell us about ourselves. They don't tell us about strange foreign people in the past who have nothing to do with us. They tell us about ourselves, and they can show us how to be better if they're understood in the proper light.
Yeah, that's very well said. I mean, like, I am someone who feels that I mean, I know that there's a lot of tensions right now, especially because of what's been going on with the Black Lives Matter movement and the whole defund the police aspect that's being talked about almost everywhere. But the one thing that I do not agree with is, well, I know for a fact that even though I am white, I know that I am not a descendant of slave owners. My family did not set foot on American soil until the 1880s. That was way after the Civil War had ended. So I don't feel that a young white child born in the year 2010, let's say, who unfortunately does have a lineage of slave owners if they're from the South, or even if they're not from the South, people do move, people roam. I don't think that that person should feel quote unquote guilty, because even though it is part of that person's lineage, it is something that really should be learned about and understood in regards to the times. That's my attitude about it. I don't think that a younger person who was lucky enough to live in the world where people do have rights and people are freer than they used to be, I just don't feel that people should feel that guilt. And at the same time, a young Black child born in 2010 who may in fact had been the descendant of slave owners, once again, shouldn't feel angry at a young white child who was born in the exact same year. Rather, they should really come together and understand their two lineages and basically say, it's nice to know that even though this was our past, we built back better. We became better over time. We are not those kinds of people, but the fact that we know where we came from, it's nice to see that our future, God willing, looks bright. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I don't think it's about feeling guilty. I think it's about feeling responsible.
That's the other thing.
Onto your shoulders the responsibility for your own character and your own choices and how you are going to move forward in this society and who you are going to be. And I think that, you go into anybody's history, you're going to find a whole mixed bag of people, some people who are great and some people who are despicable. And that's true for everyone. And I don't think anybody deserves to be shamed for the sins of their father, if you will, or the sins of your mother, if you will. It's that you have to take responsibility for who you are today. And part of that is taking responsibility, like I said, for our own capacity to make those same mistakes and to commit those same grievances against your fellow man. Like, no, if I don't think anybody can say, I'm made out of a different material, I'm made out of a different metal, and I'm not capable of hurting and harming other people unjustly. No, you absolutely are.
Absolutely.
And until you wrest that on, that's within inside of you, you can't move forward. And I think that's just work that we each, that's part of becoming a mature person. That's part of self-actualization. And that's just what all have to do to move forward in society. It's my responsibility. It's my responsibility when I walk around in my neighborhood and I participate in my community. It's not somebody else's. And when you feel that, then it calls you up to better behavior is what it does. And it gives you something honorable to fight for.
Right. And this actually brings up something that's actually not on the question list, but I definitely feel that this topic leads right into this.
Okay.
I think the big topic that's really another hot button is separating the art from the artist. I mean, we already mentioned Harry Potter to a great extent right now, but we know what's happening right now with J.K. Rowling. And I don't know about you, but I think that she's really got to be a little bit more careful with what she's doing right now, because it's sad to see so many people now seeing what she's doing and basically, you know, they may not show it on the outside, but I see a lot of people crying on the inside saying, I can't look at my Harry Potter merchandise. I can't pick up this book anymore. But, you know, even from a political standpoint, like I had a friend who had a Black Widow Funko Pop, but she hates Scarlett Johansson. Like, she does not appreciate her views on things. I'm like, but that's not a Scarlett Johansson pop you have on your shelf, my friend. That's a Black Widow pop. Embrace the character, not necessarily the actor who portrayed said character. Because unfortunately, one of the few things that is happening right now, and we can even weave cancel culture into this, the fact that people are trying to dig as deep as they can to dig up as much dirt as they can on specific celebrities and specific authors, etc., etc. I don't necessarily feel that that's something that is good or bad. Honestly, I'm somewhat neutral there. But like you said, does everybody have the possibility of showing something evil deep inside them? The answer is absolutely yes. And I still remember when they called out Kevin Hart for saying some bad things, and he didn't host the Oscars because of that. It's just a strange world, but I still feel that, like, look, I'll give you some, I don't really say this much because there's never really the opportunity, but I know for a solid fact that Phil Collins is not someone who's really fond of Jewish people. He's actually very anti-Semitic. But there are still so many Jewish people that listen to Phil Collins' music because they just like the music. You know, do you see where I'm going with that? Like, how do you feel about the whole concept of separate the art from the artist? Can we do that?
Well, first of all, I want to say that I totally understand the feelings of people who are hurt by expressed views from people who are celebrities, who have a lot of power, whose voice carries far, right? And so I think you just have to respond to just listen to your heart in one sense. Like, if it's hurtful to you, by no means do you need to support J.K. Rowling or Phil Collins or anybody else. You know, no one's going to make you do that. And I think really where the struggle happens is that obviously there's economic power that's being entangled here because we support the arts monetarily, which means that we support the person personally. So how can I separate the art from the artist when I know that the money that I spend is going economically to ensure this person to have continual power? And then there's so this is me being like equivocating because this is my personality.
No, but no, I'm sorry, but I just want to say that I totally understand where you're coming from, and I want to hear more of this.
Yeah, it's because I think it's important to parse out the issue from multiple sides. And yeah, I also think that it's not J.K. Rowling's or anybody else's responsibility to have opinions that correspond 100% to your own. That's what the marketplace of ideas is for. And whether you or not you agree with her, you know, you have to put out, she has a right to put out her opinions and her ideas and have self-expression. This goes back to my real nervousness about censoring people, which is what cancel culture essentially is that you're you're advocating a type of censorship. And it goes back to this idea where it's like people are intrinsically valuable. J.K. Rowling has intrinsic value. She's a human being with feelings and emotions, and she deserves to be treated with dignity. She doesn't deserve to be called names. She doesn't deserve to be treated with disrespect. If you disagree with her ideas, you need to meet her on the level of ideas and let the ideas be debated out in the marketplace of ideas. Now, as to whether you economically support her by buying Harry Potter merch or continuing to enjoy the Harry Potter stories or even talk about them, which is another way of giving, sort of credence and power to her whole franchise, is a different story. I think that's a question where you have to kind of go to your own heart and say, how much is this personally hurting me? And what do I feel comfortable with? I don't know if there's necessarily a moral stance there. But I do think that, if these ideas are bad and dangerous, we need to combat them at the philosophical level. To engage in ad hominem attacks, to engage in just being despicable online to people is just as hurtful. It's just as wrong. It's just as bad. And I can't say that she doesn't have a right to her own opinion or to even share it. It's like, no, if you want to I don't know, if you want to checkmate her, then you need to engage with her at the level of ideas. And I think we see a lot of people actually doing that. We see a lot of people sharing videos on the trans perspective and where J.K. Rowling has gone wrong and what she's talking about in the TERF sort of definition of feminism and that sort of thing. And so there are people engaging with her at the level of ideas, and that's really what it comes down to.
I agree with you. Yeah, I mean, again, I'm with you. I am very much someone who is very fearful of the fact that censorship is really seeping in when we know that the First Amendment of our Constitution is the right to free speech. And the one thing that is very much a very debatable thing is the concept of hate speech. Unfortunately, hate speech is still free speech. And right now, the only way to truly tell someone that hate speech is no longer allowed is you gotta pass a bill in our government. That's the only way that you can make that change. So if you are someone out there that wants to make that change, I will not say that that's something you cannot do. But at the end of the day, it's going to be what the total consensus votes on, and that's the thing that gets everybody nervous, because the other hot button topic right now is the whole thing about the statues, and that very much coincides with the classics, because these are figureheads that have been around for many, many years, and I totally understand the wanting to remove the Confederate statues from public squares, because I understand why those statues were erected, the fact that they were done mostly in the 1930s and 1960s during the era of Jim Crow. So I totally agree with the fact that those should not be in public squares and they should be in museums. But the fact that we are now basically seeing people saying that George Washington and Thomas Jefferson should not be held in high regard because they were slave owners, it's a very slippery slope. That might not even be the right word, but yes, we need to understand that slavery was a thing back in the 1700s. But the fact that they were part of putting this Bill of Rights that were part of the Constitution and even the Declaration of Independence together, the fact that this country is here because of what they did, it's important to know what the fact that they were not necessarily the perfect people, but I don't think that it's right to do something like remove a statue of George Washington or remove Mount Rushmore, because the question is, when that's said and done, what's next? Like, how far does it go? You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it kind of goes back to our discussion about, the way in which we commemorate it. Do we make it a memorial where it's a reminder of both the good and the bad, where it becomes perhaps a moment of conviction and humility. Like, again, I would point out my example of Germany, where they do have memorials of Nazism, not to remind them or to glorify it, but to remind them of what it was. And so it's all about the attitude in which it's approached. To erase it is a huge mistake. To glorify it is also a huge mistake. To pretend like these people did not have flaws, did not make huge mistakes, did not make errors in equality is horrible. Absolutely not. But I think to erase it completely from our history is also a terrible, terrible mistake. We need the reminder of our capacity for good and our capacity for evil. And you know, obviously, what Thomas Jefferson wrote throughout his political career was some of the most foundational works for human freedom. I mean, in the same hand that he had slaves, he also set the foundation for their freedom in the future because of the principles that he outlined. So was he perfect? No. Is he condemnable? Absolutely. Should we forget him? Absolutely not. Because again, it goes back to this understanding of what are the foundational principles that we're ripping out at the same time that we're making proper re-examinations of some of these other aspects that are very dark and very blamable.
Right. And I also want to also say that I truly appreciate the fact that you agree with things that I had said to so many people. The only way that we're really going to be able to find common ground on these controversial topics is if we actually bring them to the table and discuss them with opposing sides. That's something that I feel is really getting lost right now, and not that many people are doing that. And even though this is a discussion of classics, that's why classics are so important. We need to take these old works, we need to bring them to the table, we need to discuss them. I mean, you know, all those young children, even when we were school kids, it was like, oh, I don't want to read this book in school, etc., etc. But the fact that we actually got to read it and got to actually discuss it with our classmates and our teachers, that's the importance of things that the past have brought us. They allow us to understand the way things were, but how we can use those elements to make our world now a better place. That's really what it is all about. And the fact that there are people that are using the concept of cancel culture, the fact that they don't want to debate these things, the fact that they just want to flat out erase things through anger is just not the right way to go. Because look, I get it. It's time for a change. There are certain things in this country that need to change. But if you're going to go at it in a specific way when you really should go in another way, the direction that you're tackling these issues right now, I feel is only going to make your case harder to achieve and accomplish with opposing parties.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I don't know what the right way to go about it is, except for to continually to be willing to have conversations about it and continually to be humble to those conversations. And one point that I wanted to kind of like circle back on in terms of like the memorials and that sort of thing and the golden age of Hollywood is that the way in which we embody these ideas matter. If we call it the golden age of Hollywood, we know that there are positive connotations with that word, and it's okay for us to refer to it in a different way. We know that having triumphant statues of these people, the way that they're shown, the context matters. It matters the way that we portray these things. So I think the most important thing is not to forget that. I know I'm repeating myself here, but I wanted to make my point clear, is not to forget it, not to erase it, but to talk about it in new ways.
Right. I mean, like, I think, you know, going into the world of popular culture, it's like the big news that happened this past weekend was the fact that Disney World reopened. Now, Disney himself was not a perfect person. We all know that. So the funny part was when they were talking about the changing of brands, like, you know, the fact that the name Aunt Jemima from the syrup company is going to be changing now. The fact that right now the Washington Redskins football team and the Cleveland Indians baseball team are now in debate to see if they should be there or if they should be changed. You know, people were joking around. Are they saying, does that mean that the Walt Disney Company should not be the Walt Disney Company anymore? You know what I mean?
No, I make the connection for me.
What I'm saying is like the whole concept of erasing the past, you know, like
Well, I will disagree with you there. I think there's real power in continuing to use the same language that we used in the past in modern times that we now consider offensive. Now, I think it's totally fine if you go to, you know, the sports center for these different, for the Washington Redskins, and you see the old jerseys, and they kind of have, you know, and in fact, even the old, like that, again, that idea of releasing it with an introduction and saying like, this is what it used to be called.
right,
And this is where we were as a country. We recognize that this is an inappropriate name, that this is an inappropriate thing to do.
right,
Calling someone Redskin is highly offensive, and we're
of
not going to
course.
glorify that anymore. So we have since changed our name. So I think it's totally fine to change the name. I don't think there's a problem with that at all. I think there's totally fine to recast our understanding with fresh perspective.
Yeah,
But think,
I think we had a little disconnect there. I was basically
yeah,
only using that for an example, just because of the fact that Walt Disney himself is not known as one of the most perfect people. So does that
I see
mean that
because
Walt Disney's, so like, should Walt Disney's statue in Disney World be taken down? Should Walt Disney World change its name? You know what I mean?
yeah. Well, I think there is a degree of difference there because I don't know. I know that Walt Disney is a mixed bag, but I don't know that his name represents anything that is racist or sexist or something like that where we should be concerned about it. Where obviously, like Redskins and Aunt Jemima has embedded language. So
Yeah,
I know I'm like parsing things out, but I do
no,
think
you
there's
are.
trenches there.
No, the whole thing with the Washington Redskins is kind of funny because of the fact that we have to remember the fact that sports teams have changed their names all the time. You know, it's like
Yeah, I know. The
people,
fact that they were clinging to it for so long is just like, it makes me so angry.
yeah, like people don't even realize that people keep forgetting the fact that the original name, I can't remember if it's the Houston Astros or the Texas Rangers, but the original name of the team was the Colt 45s. So I'm
Yeah.
like, teams have changed their names, you know? The most important thing in regards to sports is just making sure that your team wins a damn championship. I think that that's really
Yeah,
what
I
it
know. Like,
is.
your brand will survive, dude. You'll still make billions of dollars. You'll be fine. You just don't have to
Yeah,
like be a jerk about it while you're doing it. So maybe don't.
exactly, exactly. So let's get into the sixth question. And once again, we're pretty much answering this question right now. And that is, are you afraid with the passage of time that these classics will be flung into obscurity and forgotten? And because of the fact that we touched on things like separating the art from the artist, and we talked about the concept of cancel culture and censorship, do you think that that is going to be a massive amount of fuel put on that proverbial fire? And how can we possibly try and salvage something from this?
You know, I'm really not afraid of that. I think it's possible for, you know, things to fall into obscurity. Like Beowulf is a really good example of that. It sort of like fell off the map and was rediscovered later, and was lost for a few hundred years, which really makes you wonder, like, what other classic stories have been lost to time. You know, it like brings up all my Indiana Jones feelings, and I want to go be an archaeologist for ancient lost texts. But I'm not afraid that the whole canon will be lost, right? And I also think that because the enduring core of these stories, like we talked about, gets repackaged in new ways, in fresh ways to be relevant to its own culture, I think there's a way in which that story just endures. So even if, you know, a particular novel that I consider a classic that I really, really love and I think is really valuable falls off the map or no longer gets published, I think the core story, the sort of eternal questions and issues that we're parsing through will continue to be retold in new ways. So the essence of the story, I think, will always be moving forward. And I also think that, like, apart from like an apocalyptic event where publishing no longer happens, you know, I just don't see the whole canon like falling off of the map. I think that there's always going to be readers who will want to connect with these stories because they're enduring and eternal stories in whatever their incarnation may be in the future. Yeah. So, and if there's an apocalyptic event, like the fall of publishing will be the least of our concerns.
Yeah, I mean, like, I still remember when Blu-rays were starting to become a lot more affordable and people were actually buying them a lot more. I remembered that there was a project that was actually funded by Martin Scorsese in regards to finding all of these older films that people may not even have known about and using the power of Blu-ray to officially restore them and send them out to the average moviegoer, or just let people know, listen, if these movies are now officially available for you. Because that's always one of the few things that makes me nervous when it comes to the concept of the reboot. I mean, I know that we've been talking about the same package being shipped around in different kind of ways, but I think that the reboot is a completely different animal, because with the reboot, you're taking something, almost always, you're taking something that people already love and you're just doing something to change it. Like, the perfect example, if you want to be controversial, was the 2016 Ghostbusters film with the all-female cast. Now, I want to personally say that I actually was very excited about seeing that movie when I first heard about it, because I like the fact that they were sticking to the whole concept of SNL cast members. You know, make sure that some of the cast members were SNL members, and they got Kate McKinnon and Leslie Jones, who are brilliant, and the fact that they got some great female comedians to play these roles was great. But the problem with that movie was the fact that they took it and they didn't want to make it Ghostbusters 3. They wanted to reinvent the wheel. They basically wanted to tell the 1984 story over again with an all-male cast. But not just that, I think that the writing was terrible, and I thought that the way that the actors could have been utilized, it was just, they were so underdone. Because I know Kristen Wiig and Melissa McCarthy are funny women. I love Bridesmaids. That's one of the funniest comedies ever made. But they just didn't do it for me in that movie. I'm like, I felt so bad for them. I'm like, what are the writers doing with these two amazing comedians? Like, I felt that there could have been so much more. And that's why the controversy was, oh, you didn't like it because it was an all-female cast. No, that's not the reason. I went to go see that movie with my wife. Last I checked, I married a woman, and even she didn't think that it was funny.
Yeah.
You know? But now there's the new Ghostbusters movie that's coming out, and some of these people who love that 2015-16 film, they're like, oh, now you like it. I'm like, no. There's a big difference here. If you would have took this new Ghostbusters movie's plot and put it in your movie, I'm pretty sure that people would have praised it and loved it.
Yeah. I always find it interesting because I've certainly changed my opinion over time about the way that I have approach, what might be called reboots. So my example is going to be Robin Hood, because
things. Boy, Robin Hood has been done how many times?
Right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So do you remember the one with Russell Crowe that was maybe 2007-ish?
You ready for this? The answer is yes. I do know it, and I remember how badly it flopped.
Yes, it flopped really badly. And I remember watching it, and there's a really strong sort of feminist undertone to it, where the female leaders make a really strong stand. And I remember watching it from a historical perspective, and kind of walking out of the movie theater and being like, that's not what would have happened with this Middle Ages time. That's historically inaccurate. These women would not have had the power that they were portrayed as having. And I remember having a conversation with my friend about it, and her counterposition, which I've now come around to and I think is right, is well, it doesn't really matter because it's a fable. Robin Hood probably didn't really exist. We're retelling this same sort of fairy tale and the same fable for modern values. And we're using the same archetypes and characters and structure to use it for our own message. And that's okay. That's what storytelling is for. It's to tell us about ourselves. And so I think, there's part of me that I have a pedantic tendency to be like, herp, but that's not historically accurate or whatever,
That's my wife. That's my wife in a nutshell. She does that all the time.
It's not sexual, and it's like, well, what is the essence though? Can I get beyond the surface level to the essence? And is the essence of value there? And I think, you know, and the counterexample to that is what you just gave, which is that, you know, on surface level, this Ghostbusters movie was trying to reframe the story and recast it with women actresses, you know, female actresses. Wonderful. That's fantastic. We want to see this all-female lead. But the essence, apparently, I haven't seen it, but, you know, in your opinion, was it wasn't a very good movie. The writing wasn't good. They didn't make, you know, give a funny script to these fantastic actresses. And so you were able to see the essence behind sort of the surface level nod to women, but then be like, here's this, you know, half-written, half thought through script, go enjoy that, you know, which is kind of an
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, Robin Hood will always be an anthropomorphic fox to me, just so you know. That's Robin Hood. That's Robin Hood to me. That's one of my favorite Disney films from 1973. But my attitude about reboots is, if you take a movie that was made in the past, and it wasn't necessarily the best movie out there. Like, I'll give you the perfect example. Clash of the Titans from 1982. It's a terrible, terrible movie. But now you're in the 2000s. Your goal here is to not make another terrible movie, which unfortunately they did. They remade Clash of the Titans, but they still made it a terrible movie. You gotta get to understand, like, we have this opportunity to take something that wasn't perfect and make it perfect. Let's get the right director. Let's get the right cast to go with these brand new technological advances in movie making. I always say, even though it is such a beloved film by many, Wolfgang Petersen's The Never-Ending Story, you can totally give that movie a much deserved makeover in terms of visual effects. But oh man, if you want to give me a winner of a reboot, then you've got to get Guillermo del Toro to direct that film, and only Guillermo del Toro, because he will do wonders with this movie. That's my attitude about a truly great reboot. Taking when people say, and it also goes back to the Disney remakes, you know, it's like, they're taking all of these Disney classics, and so many people are just not interested in them. Like, so many people thought that the Lion King that came out last year was pointless. It was like, okay, Beyonce's in it, big whoop. That's not the point. You got the exact same movie with CGI characters that looked lifelike. They were still animated, but they were lifelike. But then you take a look at the live action Cinderella or the live action Jungle Book, or, believe it or not, the one that I had no intentions to see, but now that I just got to get myself to a movie theater when it's opened, I'm interested in seeing the new Mulan, because it looks like they're trying to bring something new. With,
you know, Mulan looks fantastic.
and and with the Jungle Book, Jon Favreau, great director. They added more character development to Mowgli, to Shere Khan, and not just the fact that they did that, they gave Idris Elba the ability to voice him. Beautiful. Christopher Walken as King Louie. I mean, how could you lose? They gave me something new, because I am not the biggest fan of the original Jungle Book. I love the music. I love Tailspin, but I think that the original animated film from 1967 is not perfect. I think that the live action Jungle Book from just the last couple of years, they gave me something new and exciting. I mean, am I going to miss Mushu in the live action Mulan? Not going to lie, 100%. If they were able to bring Mushu back and have Eddie Murphy voice it, I would have been there front row center, because I love Eddie Murphy as Mushu. But the story itself looks very intriguing.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's just like there's no way that it can't be a different thing. I think there's a heaviness and a gravitas to film, and once you put live actors in it, there's a level of realism that we just expect that we don't, you know, obviously expect when we go into watching an animated film. The way that we just feel about it is different, and our experience is different. So you have to match the story and the shot choices and all, and the script and everything, the way that the music interplays with it. It's going to be different. And I say this actually a lot about like film adaptations of books as well, which is like they're side by side works of art, and a lot of times they hold their own. And there's no reason why, you know, I'm not of the opinion necessarily that the book is always better than the movie. I prefer books to movies by and large, so I'm probably going to prefer the book. But oftentimes, the film adaptation of a movie is its own work of art in its own right. You know, the costume directors who do all of this research, the furniture, the sets, the people who are experts in like the etiquette and the way that they should interact with each other, and plus the way that the book needs to be severely adapted for film. I mean, it's really a work of art, and it's something that has to be so finely done. And I think there needs to be a real appreciation for the way in which the medium shapes the artwork. And we need to be a little bit more as readers, we need to be a little bit more flexible in that, because the film medium is different. What it demands of its story is different.
Yes, and that's why I follow the line, don't judge a book by its movie. I always feel that it is important to see the story told in two different formats. And I always try to do my very best to read the book before the movie comes out. I was fortunate enough to have read the Harry Potter books before they came out into films. I was fortunate enough to see read the Lord of the Rings before the films came out, and I got to admit, I think the films are better than the books when it comes to Lord of the Rings, especially when you read those, especially when you watch those extended editions. Those are just beautiful films in general. But going into the last question, and I feel that we can definitely talk about a couple of other things in regards to this, and that is, what can we learn moving forward in regards to what has already been done and in regards to moving forward? It's like, can we recapture that classic element? And the reason why I say that is because everything that we've discussed, one of the few things that I know that a lot of people are getting very upset about is when it comes to the next big movie that's coming out, it is now seeming to be just a reboot or a sequel. And honestly, if I were to give my own personal thoughts on that matter, I think it's because of the fact that people, whether they are directors, whether they are writers, I think that because of the fact that where we are now as a society, people are afraid to push boundaries right now. Because when you take a look, even when you go into the 1980s and 90s, people were pushing boundaries based on what was given to them in the past, like the teen comedy. It's truly started a trend with Animal House, and then it goes into the John Hughes era, and then the Kevin Smith era, and now all of a sudden people are afraid to write comedies because they're afraid they're going to offend somebody. You know, and that's what gets me very nervous about the future of entertainment, because people are just afraid to push those boundaries right now because they're afraid of getting canceled and censored.
Yeah, I think that there's a huge amount of social pressure to conform right now to and toe the party line, which I don't think is healthy for conversation, for honest conversation. And I think even when it's done with the best of intentions, like even surrounding the, you know, some of the controversial things that we're dealing with, how do I say this? It's fine for white people to feel uncomfortable having conversations about racism against Black people. That's okay. We can handle it. Like it's fine to feel uncomfortable. You can get over yourselves. But what I do think is probably something that we should be aware of is that we, or at least I, for myself, I want this change to be sincere, to be long lasting, to be indelible, to become part of who I am. I don't want it to be a surface thing. And I think when there's so much social pressure to conform, that may be the case for some people. That may be the experience for some people. And I guess all I can say is that I wish that it weren't.
Yeah, because right.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I'm saying that like we're in the whole damned if you do, damned if you don't mentality right now.
Go on. What do you mean?
Well, I'm saying it's like the perfect example where I first started learning about all this stuff was what happened with Sarah J. Maas. You know, she writes that groundbreaking trilogy, the Court series, and she gets torn a new one because of the fact that her story did not have a diverse cast. So then when she writes the third installment of her series, she makes it extremely diverse, and everybody's saying to her, well, now you're too little too late. You know what I mean? That's what gets me very upset. The fact that it's not about the diversity of your cast. It's not about having specific people fitting a specific mold. What it really comes down to is your story good? Is your story captivating? I don't necessarily feel that the only characters that I personally will connect with are characters who are white, or characters who are straight, or even characters who are Jewish. If that was my true attitude, one of my favorite movies of all time would not be Beverly Hills Cop. You know? You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I think it is really hard for creators to sort of say, you know, I'm hearing what the public is saying and sort of take those, you know, internalize those messages and then respond through their artwork and still be condemned with the way that they're responding to it. I'm not particularly familiar with the Sarah J. Maas situation, but you know, I just see that there's like so little grace is what I see. And I wrote about this a little bit on one of my blogs, is that, you know, this is new territory for all of us. We're going to make mistakes in the way that we move forward. We're going to make mistakes in the way that we talk about it. I know that I'm going to make mistakes in the way that I talk about it, but I want to kind of extend to anybody in my sphere the grace to move forward to the best of their ability. If you're doing it, you know, sincerely, if you're trying, I think that matters a lot more. If you're willing to say, I'm sorry, I need you to be willing to forgive me, you know? And I just see that there's like a real lack of grace. But on the flip side, here I go again, equivocating, but I get it. I get the anger. I understand it. I understand where the bitterness is coming from. I think it's totally valid, those emotions and the fire that's behind them and the passion that's behind them. I totally understand it. I do.
Yeah. I mean, like, two of the most perfect examples that I can provide are, you know, the HBO series Westworld and a movie that I actually just watched over the weekend called The Old Guard. You know, these casts are extremely diverse. Lots of different people from lots of different backgrounds in this television show and in this movie. But honestly, the stories are so captivating, and the character development in these two stories is so rich that I don't even realize that this is a diverse cast. I just see great people acting to the best of their abilities and giving me a great story. That's what it is for me. I need storytelling. I need people not being afraid to tell a story regardless of how they want to tell it. That's the thing about freedom. You have the ability to tell your story however you want, and just because of the fact that your cast may be all black or all brown or all white does not mean that it's not inclusive. That's what I'm trying to explain. It's something that should be embraced by everybody. Like, there's nothing wrong with a bunch of white kids listening to Jay-Z. There's nothing wrong with the fact that hip-hop / rap music became extremely popular because of three Jewish boys from Manhattan called the Beastie Boys, and they got all of these rap artists to be mainstream music. You know, it's not about the skin color. It's not about your demographic. It's the fact that you brought something fresh to the table. You gave something out there to embrace that for everybody. That's what really upsets me these days. The fact that we're trying to be inclusive. We're trying to let everybody know that we're allowed to share everything, but we're sort of like, I dare I say it, I sometimes feel that we're segregating ourselves and we don't even know it in a weird, unfortunate way.
Yeah. You know, and I think I understand the counter position too, which is that maybe the same opportunities haven't been presented for people of color. And I think
That's
that's
true.
absolutely true. When we look at the sort of systemic education that they have access to, when
Uh-huh.
we look at historical poverty and those sorts of things,
Uh-huh.
when we look at the perhaps systemic, you know, the systemic racism that might exist in publishing, in film, in blah, blah, blah. And I think that's part of what makes something like, you know, that makes it so that we need to say, historically, this has not, that equal opportunity hasn't been there. So to whatever extent we can make the opportunities equal is our responsibility moving forward. And I can't do it for anybody else, right? I can only do it in my community. And then it's that person's responsibility to take that opportunity and move forward and tell those great stories.
Absolutely. I truthfully feel that
Because,
we,
well, and I will want to add this other thing is that we
yeah,
see over and over again how powerful diversity is in making all of us better. One of the reasons I've read a recent statistic, and I'm going to botch it because I don't have it in front of me, about the success of VC firms, venture capitalist firms. And the more diverse the board on the VC firm was, the more successful they were, whether that be across gender lines of male, female, whether that be across race lines. They were more profitable. And so even on the level of like just anecdotally, we see the way in which diversity makes us stronger and makes us more powerful, makes us more wise, that we have these alternative perspectives sort of brought to the table to advise and give us a varied approach to life. They have different lived experience, and each person does. And so I think that's where the equal opportunity becomes the sort of like foundational ethic that I'm fighting for, that I think we all should be fighting for.
yeah, and I truthfully feel that that classic element can be recaptured. Quite frankly, I think that there are some directors that are trying to do that right now, and they're trying to bring some of these truly great things that made what our popular culture atmosphere is now. I really think that there are some people that are trying to be bold and bringing us into the next wave, like geniuses like Jordan Peele, who has basically revolutionized the horror film, to some of these other new young directors. I mean, for crying out loud, there was this no-name director who decided to make a Sonic the Hedgehog movie, and it became one of the most loved movies of 2020 because he actually stuck to the source material but gave them something new. I mean, that was a whole interesting conversation all in itself, but I really feel that there are some people out there that are definitely people who have embraced the classics and want to share it with other people, and basically not for the sake of basically saying this is not what it was, this is what we can use for the what it could be, you know?
Yeah. And I think I want to add one more thing here too, which is that the elephant in the room here as we talk about these issues of race and the way that they're embodied historically in our art, or sexuality, or transgenderism, or all of these other issues that are really sensitive that we've talked on, is that, you know, neither of us are people of color. Neither, you know, both straight. We're both, you know, part of the sort of standard operating procedure, if you will. Like, I think I have a valid position to bring forward just because of my human right, but I also have a valid position to listen. And I
Right.
think that's really important. And I think that's also the attitude that I would carry towards classics as well, is that the main thing that we need to do with classics is wrestle with them. We need to engage with them. I think what classics have done for me is they have really challenged me on what I believe and why. And it's sort of like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? It's like, if I don't like go to bed at a regular time and have regular sleep and like eat regular meals, and if I don't have a safe place to live, or my housing is uncertain, then it's really hard for me to build like sort of everything else on top of it. And I would say the same thing is true for classics, because they challenge me on such a foundational level of what I believe and why. If those foundational ideas aren't solid, it's easy for me to be buffeted around by what is popular versus what is true. It's easy for me to be influenced by a charismatic speaker. It's easy for me to be influenced by a message that maybe appeals to my selfish impulses. And I think that, you know, I'm really, really proud of what our society is doing right now by contending with these issues and grappling with them.
Right.
And I think that's a skill that reading classics really offers, because these views that are represented in these books are not modern views. And so we have to wrestle with them and reconcile ourselves with them. Sort of say like, okay, well, I disagree with this. Why?
Yes.
And it forces you to really think about it. And I think that those same skills are very, very important as we move forward in these conversations that we've been discussing today.
Yes, you got to come at a conversation / debate with a why, and if it ends up being willing to agree to disagree, there's nothing wrong with that. So quite frankly, everybody, that's going to wrap up our conversation. Alexandra, this was fantastic. Thank you so much for bringing so much amazing insight on this topic. This was such a great time, and I'm just so glad that we finally managed to get this completed today.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for letting me share some of my ideas.
Well, I really do appreciate your ideas, and I know that you and I are going to be in touch, and I'm pretty sure that there's going to be many more ideas that you and I will share. Who knows, maybe one day we'll work together again, maybe on your channel. That would be wonderful.
That would be fantastic.
But anyway, everybody, just thank you very much for tuning in today. This was fantastic, and I'm glad that you enjoyed this episode of Sunday Sit Downs, and I'm looking forward to the next episode where, as always, we will have another great topic, but also another great YouTuber to discuss it with. Thank you all for watching. Hey, thank you so much for stopping by my channel today. If you're new here and want to see more of what my channel has to offer, please click on the link to my last video or hit that subscribe button to be kept up to date with all of my uploads. Content of all sorts is posted here quite often, so trust me, you do not want to fall behind. I will see you in the comments, and actions speak louder than words.